48 BCE, the harbor of Alexandria. The air is not clear and filled with the scent of spices and sea salt. It is thick, acrid and choking, tasting of burnt honey and history turning to ash. An inhuman hum permeates the city, the sound of a great fire consuming not just wood and sailcloth, but the very memory of the world. Along the docks of the Ptolemaic dynasty's great port, the legions of Gaius Julius Caesar, men of iron and brutal practicality, are locked in a desperate battle, their fire-tipped arrows and siege engines having unleashed an inferno they can no longer control. But the true catastrophe is not the burning fleet or the crumbling warehouses. The true horror is unfolding within the Bruchaion, the royal quarter, where the daughter institution of the Great Library, a treasure house containing over 400,000 papyrus scrolls, has caught the flame. This is not merely a building burning. It is the central nervous system of the ancient world being severed. Each scroll curling into a black, weightless husk is a universe of thought disappearing forever. The lost plays of Aeschylus, the complete histories of Berossus, the astronomical charts of the Babylonians. And somewhere in that roaring furnace, turning to smoke and bitter regret, are 9 distinct, meticulously collected, and profoundly revered volumes of poetry. 9 books that represent the complete life's work of a woman who had been dead for 5 centuries, a woman the scholars of this very library had crowned the 10th Muse. This was the first great death of Sappho of Lesbos. It was a physical annihilation, a foreshadowing of the centuries of deliberate suppression and accidental loss to come, a seemingly final act in the erasure of a voice that was too passionate, too female, too honest for the empires that would follow. It was an act of imperial carelessness that should have been an ending. Instead, it became the dramatic prologue to the greatest mystery in literary history. This is the narrative of her, the woman whose intimate whispers, meant for a handful of lovers in a private garden, somehow survived the crash of civilizations. This was the saga of Sappho of Lesbos, a name that resonates with a power that defies its own fragmentary, almost ghostly survival. To understand her is to confront the central paradox of history. How can something as fragile as a line of poetry, written on brittle papyrus, about a feeling as fleeting as a glance across a room, prove more durable than the granite statues of pharaohs, the bronze eagles of Roman legions, and the theological doctrines that built and shattered nations? Why did her voice, the voice of a woman from a small provincial island in the Aegean, become the universal and eternal symbol of love itself? What is the alchemy that allowed her words, often just shards of sentences, to outlive the very empires that sought to first possess and then destroy them? We must ask this question because her survival was not a passive act of endurance. It was an active, recurring miracle, a testament to a power that history, with its focus on armies and economies, consistently underestimates. The story of Sappho is not merely about what was lost, the staggering 99% of her work that has vanished forever, but about the breathtaking fact that anything survived at all. To solve this riddle, to comprehend how a woman's heart became an immortal fortress, we must first travel back in time, not just to the woman herself, but to the turbulent, brilliant, and violent world that spawned her, a world where the very idea of a personal voice was a radical and revolutionary invention. It was a world teetering on the edge of a new consciousness, and she was to become its most sublime and enduring oracle, a prophetess not of gods or kings, but of the human heart in all its terrifying and beautiful complexity. This journey is not just a recovery of lost verses. It is a rediscovery of a fundamental human truth. She was the first to articulate with such devastating clarity. To understand this woman, we must return to the world of the 7th century, before the Common Era, a world in violent and brilliant transition. This is not the classical Greece of marble temples and serene philosophy we often imagine. This is the Archaic Age, a chaotic and electrifying crucible. The great centralized Bronze Age empires that had once dominated the landscape had long since crumbled into myth, leaving behind a power vacuum filled by a new and radical political experiment. The polis, the independent city-state. All across the Hellenic world, from the coasts of Ionia to the shores of Sicily, these fiercely competitive city-states were rising, each a laboratory of governance, warfare, and identity. This was an age of tyrants and lawgivers, of figures like Pittacus in her own city of Mytilene and Solon in Athens, strongmen and reformers who wrestled with the fundamental questions of social order. It was a world being stitched together by trade and colonization, as Greek ships, the black-prowed Pentaconters, sliced through the Mediterranean, establishing new cities and carrying new ideas. And looming on the geopolitical horizons were the great, older powers. The opulent, crumbling kingdom of Egypt to the south, and to the east, the rising, formidable empire of Lydia, whose immense wealth would give the world the concept of coinage, and whose expansionist ambitions were a constant threat to the Greek cities of the Anatolian coast, including those on the island of Lesbos. But the most profound revolution was not political or economic, it was psychological. The old world of the epic, the world of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, had told the stories of gods and collective heroes, of the fate of armies and nations. Now, for the first time, a new voice was emerging from the chorus, the voice of the individual I. This was the dawn of lyric poetry, a seismic shift in human consciousness, where poets began to speak not of the deeds of Achilles, but of their own personal joy, their political anger, their private grief, and most explosively of all, their own desire. This was the world that awaited Sappho, a world of intense political strife, burgeoning wealth, and a revolutionary new art form perfectly suited for the exploration of the self. She did not simply appear in this world, she was its ultimate and most perfect expression. Sappho was born into the heart of this storm, on the island of Lesbos, a jewel in the Aegean Sea, positioned at a vital crossroads of trade and culture. Her birthplace, the city of Mytilene, was not some sleepy backwater. It was a bustling, wealthy, and politically volatile maritime power. Its strategic location made it a nexus point where the cultures of mainland Greece, the ancient civilizations of Anatolia, and the maritime empire of Egypt converged, creating a uniquely cosmopolitan and sophisticated atmosphere. She was a product of the aristocracy, born into a powerful and wealthy clan, a fact that granted her privileges and education unimaginable for most women in the ancient world. But this status was a double-edged sword. The Mytilene of her time was racked by vicious internal power struggles, a seemingly endless cycle of coups and counter-coups between rival aristocratic families. Figures like the tyrant Pittacus, later celebrated as one of the 7 sages of Greece, rose to power amidst this chaos, often by banishing their political opponents. Sappho's own family was deeply enmeshed in these conflicts, and this early exposure to the brutal realities of power, to the sudden reversals of fortune, and to the experience of exile, would profoundly shape her worldview. Unlike in the increasingly rigid and patriarchal society of Athens, women on Lesbos, particularly those of the upper class, enjoyed a remarkable degree of social freedom and cultural participation. They could inherit and manage property, they were educated, and they played a central role in the rich religious and cultural life of the island. This unique environment, a fertile ground of intellectual vibrancy, political danger, and relative female autonomy, was the soil in which her genius took root. It forged in her a character of immense sensitivity and artistic inclination, yet also one with a keen understanding of the precariousness of life and the intensity of human relationships, themes that would become the very bedrock of her poetic universe. Her voice was not born in a vacuum. It was forged in the specific, high-stakes crucible of late 7th century Lesbos. Her first significant step into the great game of her era was not a political maneuver or a military alliance, but an act of profound, cultural and social creation. Sappho established what is known as the Theosos, a formally organized circle of young, unmarried women, primarily from aristocratic families, gathered under her tutelage. To call this institution merely a school for girls is a profound understatement that misses its revolutionary significance. It was a self-contained world, a sanctuary dedicated to the joint cult of Aphrodite, the goddess of love, and the Muses, the goddesses of the arts. Within this circle, these young women were educated in the skills considered essential for a refined aristocratic life. They learned to sing, to play the lyre, to dance, to compose poetry, and to carry themselves with grace and poise. But it was far more than a finishing school. It was an intensely emotional and spiritual community, a space where the bonds between the girls and their mentor, Sappho, were forged with an intensity that transcended simple pedagogy. This was Sappho's stage, her audience, and her primary inspiration. The daily life of the Theosos, the religious festivals, the preparations for weddings, as members departed the circle, the arrivals of new girls, the rivalries, the friendships, the heartbreaks. This became the raw material for her art. The poems were not abstract philosophical treatises on love. They were immediate, personal, and born of specific moments within this community. They were performance pieces, meant to be sung to the accompaniment of the lyre in front of this very audience of beloveds. In creating the Theosos, Sappho carved out a unique space for the female experience in a world overwhelmingly dominated by men's voices and men's stories. She was not just a poet. She was a spiritual leader, a choir master, and the central figure in a vibrant female subculture. And it was this very act of community building that allowed her to create a body of work of such unparalleled intimacy and emotional depth. The driving force behind Sappho's creative torrent was not the ambition for political power or the desire for public fame, but something far more fundamental and powerful: the sacred madness of Eros. This was her inner demon, though to call it a demon is to apply a modern, negative connotation to a force the Greeks understood as a divine, overwhelming, and often terrifying power. For Sappho, love was not a gentle, romantic sentiment. It was a profound, destabilizing, and deeply spiritual experience. It was, as she famously wrote, the bittersweet, irresistible creature that loosens the limbs. Her motivation was the urgent, almost desperate need to capture these fleeting, violent, and sacred moments of human connection and preserve them against the relentless tide of time. She approached the passions of the human heart with the reverence and precision of a priestess observing a sacred rite. Her poetry is a catalog of the physical and emotional symptoms of desire: the tongue that goes silent, the delicate fire that runs beneath the skin, the ears that hum, the cold sweat, the trembling that seizes the entire body. This was not melodrama. It was a meticulous, almost clinical diagnosis of a divine possession. She saw that these moments of intense emotion, the searing jealousy of seeing a beloved speaking with another, the gut-wrenching sorrow of a farewell, the blissful surrender of a shared glance, were the moments when human beings were most intensely alive, closest to the divine. Her entire poetic project can be understood as an act of consecration, an attempt to build a temple of words where these ephemeral, powerful feelings could be housed forever. This compulsion to articulate the inarticulable, to give immortal form to mortal passions, was the secret engine of her genius. It is why her poetry feels so intensely, almost painfully, immediate even after 2.5 millennia. She was not merely writing about love, she was transcribing its very essence directly from the source. Sappho's most fateful encounter was not with a specific person, not a patron, a rival, or a lover, but with an idea, a revolutionary shift in human consciousness that was just beginning to ripple across the Greek world. She came of age at the precise historical moment of the birth of lyric poetry, and her genius was to collide with this new technology of the soul with an unparalleled force. For centuries, the dominant mode of poetic expression had been the epic, the grand, impersonal narrative of gods, wars, and the fates of entire peoples, as exemplified by Homer. The poet was a vessel, a channel for the voice of the muse who sang of legendary heroes and their monumental deeds. The focus was external, collective, and mythic. But in the ferment of the 7th century BCE, this began to change. Poets across the Greek world, like Archilochus with his bitter invectives, and Alcaeus of Mytilene with his political drinking songs, began to turn the poetic lens inward. They started to use the first-person pronoun, I, not as a narrative convention, but as an authentic expression of personal, subjective experience. This was a revolution as profound as the invention of the alphabet. It was the birth of the individual as a worthy subject of art. Sappho did not invent this movement, but she seized upon it and perfected it, applying its power to the realm of emotion with a focus and intensity that no one before or since has ever quite matched. Her fateful encounter was with the radical possibility that the inner world of a single person, specifically a woman, was as vast, as dramatic, and as worthy of immortalization as the Trojan War. She took the I of the new lyric poetry and made it the I of a heart in the grip of passion, creating a language for intimacy that simply had not existed before. This collision between her unique personal genius and the nascent art form of the lyric is the foundational event of her entire legacy. She defined what this new poetry could do, demonstrating that the landscape of a human soul was the greatest frontier an artist could possibly explore. For a voice so dedicated to the private world of the heart, the brutal intrusion of public affairs was an inevitability in the turbulent politics of Mytilene. The price of Sappho's cultural power and her family's high standing was exile. The aristocratic clan to which she belonged was on the losing side of one of Mytilene's vicious power struggles, a conflict that saw the tyrant Pittacus rise to ultimate authority. As was common practice, the losing faction and their prominent supporters were banished from the city to neutralize them as a political threat. Sometime around the year 600 BCE, Sappho was forced to flee Lesbos, finding refuge far away in Sicily. This event, though likely temporary, represents a critical juncture in her story. It was a harsh and sobering lesson in the precariousness of life, demonstrating that no amount of artistic genius or cultural prestige could insulate a person from the raw mechanics of political power. The exile shattered the sanctuary of her Thyasos, scattering her circle of beloved students and companions. This experience of forced separation, of longing for home and for the faces of those she loved, undoubtedly infused her later poetry with a profound and authentic sense of loss and desire. We can hear the echo of this pain in the fragments that speak of remembering absent friends or dreaming of their presence. The exile was a personal catastrophe, but it was also a crucible that deepened her art, adding the bitter notes of sorrow and distance to her exploration of love. Furthermore, it cemented her status as a significant public figure. One is not exiled for being an insignificant schoolteacher. One is exiled for being a person of influence, whose family and whose own cultural weight are perceived as a threat to the ruling regime. This period of her life underscores the fact that she was never merely a reclusive artist, but a woman deeply embedded in the political and social fabric of her time, whose life and art were shaped by the same forces of ambition, envy, and conflict that have driven human history. The greatest and most persistent antagonist Sappho faced was not a rival poet or a political tyrant, but a far more insidious and powerful foe: oblivion itself. This enemy was not a single entity, but a three-headed beast that attacked her legacy across millennia. The first head of this beast was political censorship and contemporary envy. In her own lifetime and shortly after, her prominence and the radical nature of her all-female community attracted suspicion and ridicule. Athenian comic playwrights of the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, living in a far more misogynistic society, began to caricature her, twisting her passionate affections into scandalous promiscuity and inventing slanderous tales to posthumously put her in her place. This was the beginning of a long tradition of misinterpretation that sought to either condemn her or neutralize her power by explaining it away. The second and more formidable head of the beast was moralistic condemnation. With the rise of Stoic philosophy in the Hellenistic and Roman periods, and more cataclysmically, the ascendancy of Christianity, her unabashed celebration of human desire and earthly love came to be seen as profoundly dangerous. She was no longer just a poet. She was a symbol of pagan decadence. Early church fathers, engaged in a life-or-death struggle to establish a new world order based on asceticism and the rejection of worldly passions, identified her as a potent ideological enemy. Her poetry was the antithesis of their teachings, a siren song of the flesh that needed to be silenced for the good of humanity's soul. The third and most relentless head of the beast was simply the indifferent, inexorable decay of time. Her words were written on papyrus, a fragile organic material susceptible to moisture, fire, and simple wear. Without a continuous, unbroken chain of scribes willing to copy and preserve her scrolls, her work was doomed to crumble into dust. For centuries, these three forces worked in concert, a perfect storm of active suppression and passive neglect that conspired to erase her completely from the memory of the world, creating a silence so profound that her eventual return would seem like nothing short of a ghost's resurrection. A pivotal moment in the distortion of Sappho's legacy, a fatal mistake not of her own making, but one inflicted upon her, was the birth and proliferation of a powerful lie. The legend of her suicidal leap from the Leucadian cliffs for the unrequited love of a handsome ferryman named Phaon. This story, which has no basis in any of her surviving works or in the accounts of her contemporaries, appears to have originated in the Athenian comedies of the 5th century BCE, a genre known for its slanderous and satirical treatment of public figures. The invention was diabolically clever in its purpose. It took the towering figure of Sappho, a woman celebrated for her profound love for other women and her central role in a powerful female community, and reframed her entire life through a purely heterosexual and ultimately pathetic lens. It reduced her complex emotional world to a simple, familiar narrative of a woman spurned by a man, driven to a desperate, hysterical end. This myth served a crucial ideological function for the increasingly patriarchal world that followed her. It neutralized the radical, challenging nature of her life and work, making her safe for posterity. The image of the love-crazy woman flinging herself into the sea was far less threatening than the image of the powerful, autonomous female artist who directed her passions where she pleased. This caricature became a psychological breaking point for her historical reputation. It was so dramatic, so memorable, so perfectly tragic, that it eclipsed the far more complex reality. For centuries, from the Roman poet Ovid, who wrote a fictional letter from Sappho to Phaon, all the way to the romantic painters and poets of the 19th century, this false legend became the dominant framework for understanding her. It was a fatal mistake of reception, a successful act of character assassination that haunted her ghost for over 2,000 years, burying the truth of her life under a mountain of tragic, romantic, and utterly fictitious melodrama. Just as it seemed the forces of censorship and decay had won, and Sappho's voice was condemned to an eternity of silence, her survival came from the most improbable of sources, an astonishing opportunity born from the chaos of history. The great libraries had burned, the monastic scribes had fallen silent, and her official collections were gone. But fragments of her poetry had been copied and circulated throughout the ancient world, not just in grand scrolls, but on scraps of papyrus used for everyday purposes. After the Roman conquest of Egypt, Greek remained a language of culture and administration for centuries. Vast quantities of papyrus documents were created: letters, contracts, tax receipts, school exercises, and literary texts. As these documents became obsolete, they were often simply discarded in huge rubbish heaps on the outskirts of towns and villages. In the unique, bone-dry climate of Egypt, protected from the ravages of moisture by the endless sands, these garbage dumps became accidental time capsules. For nearly 2 millennia, they lay undisturbed. Then, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeologists began to excavate these sites, most notably at the village of Oxyrhynchus. What they found was the single greatest treasure trove of classical texts ever discovered. And amidst the tax records and personal letters, they found scraps of poetry. More than that, they found that discarded papyrus was a valuable commodity in the funerary industry. It was used to make papier-mâché-like wrappings for mummies, known as cartonnage, or was sometimes even stuffed inside the embalmed bodies of sacred crocodiles to give them form. In a twist of fate that beggars belief, modern scholars began the painstaking process of dissolving this ancient cartonnage and unpeeling the layers of papyrus. And on these fragile, recycled scraps, they found the faint, unmistakable Greek letters spelling out lines of poetry that had not been read in over 1,000 years. It was Sappho, returning from the dead, her verses saved not by reverent librarians, but by the refuse of a forgotten society and the sacred guts of a reptile. This was the ultimate opportunity from chaos, a miracle of preservation that proved her voice was so essential it would find a way to survive even in the most ignominious of graves. Long before her near-total disappearance, Sappho's work experienced a posthumous golden age, a period of triumph where her reputation reached its zenith in the Hellenistic and Roman worlds. Following her death, her fame, which had already spread during her lifetime, grew exponentially. Her poetry was collected, edited, and studied by the greatest scholars of the age. The intellectual center of this reverence was the very Library of Alexandria that would later tragically burn. There, in the 3rd century BCE, the brilliant grammarians and critics Aristophanes of Byzantium and Aristarchus of Samothrace undertook the monumental task of compiling the definitive edition of her work. They organized her vast poetic output into 9 distinct volumes, categorized by their specific poetic meter. This act of canonization was the ancient world's equivalent of a Nobel Prize in literature, a Nobel Prize for eternity. To be included in the Alexandrian canon was to be certified as a master, a classic whose work was deemed essential for the education of every civilized Greek-speaking person. But Sappho was not merely included, she was elevated above almost all others. She was given the honorific title, the poetess, just as Homer was known as the poet. The praise was universal and ecstatic. The philosopher Plato, a man not known for his effusive compliments, was said to have called her the 10th Muse, a divine addition to the traditional 9 goddesses of the arts. The Roman poet Horace urged his fellow countrymen to study the lesbian poetess, adapting her unique meters into the Latin language and ensuring her influence would flow directly into the heart of Roman literature. This was her greatest triumph, a woman from a small island whose work was intensely personal and focused on the lives of women, was now universally acclaimed by the male intellectual establishment of the Mediterranean's greatest empires as an artist of unparalleled genius and importance. Her voice, born in a private garden, now echoed in the marble halls of the world's most powerful cultures. To comprehend the psychology of this triumph, we must imagine the sheer, world-altering power of her artistic achievement as it was perceived by the ancient world. The scholars who crowned her the 10th Muse were not engaging in mere hyperbole. They were attempting to describe a phenomenon that felt genuinely supernatural. Her triumph was the victory of the intimate over the epic, the personal over the political. In a literary world dominated by stories of war, monsters, and the grand destinies of men, Sappho had performed a kind of magic. She had taken the smallest, most private moments of human experience, a fleeting memory of a loved one's gait, the color of a forgotten dress, the sound of a familiar laugh, and invested them with a weight and significance equal to the fall of Troy. She revealed that the landscape of a single human heart in the grip of desire was as vast, as dangerous, and as worthy of exploration as any heroic battlefield. The psychology of her triumph lies in this very act of elevation. She gave humanity a new language, a new way of seeing itself. Before her, the overwhelming emotions of love and jealousy were powerful, but largely inarticulate forces. She provided the precise, perfect words for them, crystallizing these feelings with such clarity that to read her was to feel understood for the first time. Her readers felt she was not just writing about her own heart, she was writing about theirs. This is why her work was not merely admired, it was beloved. It became a mirror in which the most profound and secret aspects of the human soul were reflected. The moment of hubris, if we can call it that, was not hers, but belonged to the idea of poetry itself. It was the moment when her art demonstrated that a few perfectly chosen words, sung to a simple lyre, could build a monument more lasting than any pyramid, an empire of emotion that would outlast the temporal power of the very civilizations that celebrated her. While one force of her legacy was the adoring scholarship of Alexandria, an equal and opposite force was gathering strength, an ideological enemy that sought not to preserve her, but to purge her from the world. This sworn enemy can be personified in a figure like Tatian the Assyrian, a prominent Christian writer and apologist of the 2nd century CE. To understand Tatian is to understand the profound cultural schism that was cleaving the Roman world in two. Tatian was a convert to Christianity, and like many converts, he possessed a fiery, uncompromising zeal. He looked upon the entirety of classical Greek culture, its philosophy, its art, its literature, and saw nothing but pagan error and moral depravity. In his work, addressed to the Greeks, he launched a blistering attack on Hellenic civilization, and he singled out Sappho for particular scorn, condemning her as a lewd, love-crazy woman who even sings of her own licentiousness. For Tatian and those who thought like him, the chemistry of the conflict was absolute. Sappho represented everything the new ascetic morality of Christianity was fighting against. Her poetry celebrated earthly love, physical desire, and passionate human connection, all of which were now being recast as temptations of the flesh, distractions from the true purpose of life, the salvation of the immortal soul. Her focus on the love between women was particularly anathematic to the rigid patriarchal hierarchy and sexual ethics of the burgeoning church. Tachen's attack was not just literary criticism, it was an act of theological warfare. He was framing Sappho as a corrupting influence, a dangerous pagan siren whose verses could lead the faithful astray. He was one of the first and most articulate voices in a chorus that would grow louder over the centuries, a chorus that demanded not just the refutation of Sappho, but her complete and total erasure. He was the sworn enemy in close-up, the face of a new world order that had no place for the Tenth Muse and would soon acquire the power to make her disappear. While kings and tyrants built their legacies in stone and territory, Sappho's construction was of an entirely different, and ultimately more enduring, nature. She was an architect of emotion, and her primary building material was language and rhythm. Her most significant and lasting reform was the development and perfection of a unique poetic meter that now bears her name, the Sapphic stanza. This specific four-line structure, with its three longer flowing lines, followed by a shorter, concluding line called an Adonian, was a work of profound, rhythmic genius. It was not a rigid, mechanical container for words, but a flexible, breathing form that perfectly mirrored the patterns of human feeling. The longer lines could build a wave of emotion, of rising passion or deepening sorrow, while the short, abrupt, final line could provide a moment of sudden insight, a sharp intake of breath, or a sigh of resignation. It was a meter tuned to the very rhythm of a heartbeat in the grip of love. In perfecting this form, she created a powerful and endlessly reusable tool for future poets. It was a technology of desire, a way to structure and amplify the expression of intimate emotion that was so effective it would be adopted and revered for millennia. Roman poets like Horace and Catullus would build their own careers on its foundation, translating its power into Latin. Centuries later, Renaissance and Romantic poets across Europe, from Petrarch to Swinburne, would revive it, finding in its ancient rhythm a perfect vessel for their own modern sensibilities. This was her great construction project. She did not build a temple of marble, but a temple of sound. She engineered a form of language that could house the most volatile human emotions, giving them a structure that was both beautiful and strong enough to withstand the erosion of centuries. Her reforms were not inscribed in law codes, but in the very DNA of Western poetry, a legacy of construction that has proven far more resilient than any physical empire. To truly feel the world of Sappho's poetry, we must zoom in past the grand sweep of history and into the sensory details of her immediate context, the onions and vegetables that gave her art its unique and potent flavor. We must imagine the Thiassos on a sun-drenched afternoon on Lesbos. The air is heavy with the scent of apple blossoms from the sacred grove of Aphrodite, mingled with the sharp, sweet smell of incense burning on a small altar. The dominant sound is the gentle, resonant pluck of the barbitos, the deep-toned lyre that was her constant companion, its notes weaving through the voices of young women singing in chorus. This was not a silent, scholarly world. It was a world of music, dance, and ritual. Central to this world were the individuals she loved and who peopled her poems. These are not abstract muses, but real women whose names echo through the surviving fragments. The beautiful Anactoria, who has gone away in a Lydian army chariot. The beloved Attis, for whom she feels a fierce jealousy. The gentle Gongola. And most intimately, there is her own daughter, Cleis, for whom she writes with a tender, maternal love, declaring that she would not trade her for all the wealth of Lydia. The poems are filled with the textures of their lives, the soft fabrics of their gowns, the golden circlets in their hair, the garlands of flowers they wove for festivals. This context, the intricate web of female relationships, mentorship, friendship, rivalry, and love, all within a shared devotional practice to the goddesses of beauty and art, is the essential nutrient that fed her poetry. Without understanding the sights, sounds, and smells of this world, and the specific, named individuals who inhabited it, her poems risk becoming beautiful but abstract declarations. It is in these details that their true, devastatingly personal power lies. They are the artifacts of a real, lived life, a life of profound connection and feeling. The first cracks in the edifice of Sappho's immense reputation began to appear as the cultural center of the Greek world shifted away from the vibrant, diverse islands of Ionia and toward the mainland, specifically to the rising power of Athens. In the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, Athens entered its golden age, and with its military and economic dominance came a powerful cultural hegemony. Athenian society, particularly in its treatment of women, was vastly different from that of archaic Lesbos. In democratic Athens, women of the upper classes were largely sequestered, excluded from public life and education, their roles confined to the domestic sphere. From this more rigid, patriarchal viewpoint, the world of Sappho, a powerful, educated woman at the center of an intense, all-female community where passionate love between women was celebrated, began to seem alien, strange, and suspicious. The primary genre of the Athenian stage was comedy, and playwrights, always eager for a target, seized upon Sappho as a figure of ridicule. They began to create a caricature of her, portraying her as a woman of uncontrollable and indiscriminate lust, often inventing scandalous heterosexual affairs for her. This was the beginning of the long, slow process of her character assassination. These were the first harbingers of the storm to come. What began as satirical misunderstanding in Athens would later be amplified by the stern moralism of Roman society, and then supercharged into outright condemnation by the theological certainty of the Christian world. The initial cracks were small, jokes on a stage, slanderous anecdotes, but they signaled a profound cultural shift. The world was changing, and its new moral frameworks had little room for the radical honesty and passionate freedom of the woman from Lesbos. The ground was being prepared for her to be recast from the 10th Muse into a symbol of moral transgression. The greatest single act that triggered the near-total annihilation of Sappho's work was not a dramatic moment of burning or destruction, but a quiet, collective, and fateful decision made over centuries in the silent scriptoriums of medieval monasteries. This was the verdict of the scribes. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the preservation of all ancient literature rested in the hands of Christian monks. These men, living lives of piety and ascetic devotion, became the sole gatekeepers of history. It was their job to choose which texts from the vast pagan past were worthy of the exhausting, expensive labor of being copied by hand onto precious parchment. Their choices were guided not by literary merit alone, but by theological utility and moral appropriateness. A classical text might be copied if it was a useful model of rhetoric, like the speeches of Cicero, or if its philosophical ideas could be reconciled with Christian doctrine, like the works of Plato. But Sappho presented a profound problem. Her 9 volumes of poetry were beautiful, but what was their Christian utility? They were perceived as morally dangerous, celebrations of a worldly, physical love that the Church was actively trying to suppress. The psychology behind this error, or deliberate choice, was not necessarily born of malicious hatred, but of a worldview in which her art was simply irrelevant and spiritually perilous. Faced with a choice between copying another manuscript of the Gospels or the epistles of St. Paul, or copying the passionate love poems of a pagan woman to other women, the choice for a devout monk was obvious. So they didn't copy her. It was a slow, silent, administrative death. With each passing decade, fewer and fewer copies of her works existed. The old papyrus scrolls, stored in monastic libraries, grew brittle and flaked away. No new parchment copies were made to replace them. This fateful, passive act of omission, repeated in monasteries across Christendom for centuries, was the true catalyst for her disappearance. The fire of Alexandria was a sudden inferno, but this was a slow, inexorable flood of neglect that quietly drowned her voice. The greatest catastrophe in the long saga of Sappho's disappearance, the moment that has become a symbol for the total destruction of her work, is the alleged book burning of the year 1073. While the historical evidence for this specific event is debated and may be apocryphal, it serves as the dramatic culmination of the millennium-long campaign against her. The story goes that in both Rome and Constantinople, by order of Pope Gregory VII, a man known for his zealous and uncompromising reforms, the remaining accessible works of Sappho were systematically sought out and publicly burned. This was to be the final, decisive act of iconoclasm, the ultimate purification of the Christian world from a potent and lingering pagan influence. We must imagine the scene. In a public square, under the stern gaze of ecclesiastical authorities, scrolls and codices containing the words that had once been the pride of the Library of Alexandria are piled high. These are not just any books. They are artifacts of a worldview, vessels of a beauty and a passion now deemed heretical. For the authorities, this was not an act of vandalism, but an act of spiritual hygiene, a necessary surgery to remove a cancerous growth from the body of Christendom. The flames that consumed the parchment were seen as holy fire, purging the world of temptation. This event, whether it happened in this exact dramatic fashion or not, represents the resolution of Act 2 of her story, the final victory of the forces of suppression. It is the logical endpoint of a process that began with the sneers of Athenian comedians and the condemnations of church fathers. After centuries of being misunderstood, slandered, and neglected, her physical presence in the world of letters was, it seemed, finally and irrevocably extinguished. This was the moment she transitioned from a censored author to a ghost. The catastrophe was not just the loss of poetry, it was the attempted murder of a way of being, the immolation of a world of feeling that the new order could no longer tolerate. Following the fires of condemnation and the long winter of scribal neglect, Sappho's presence in the world collapsed into an almost complete silence. For the entirety of the High Middle Ages and the early Renaissance, a period spanning nearly 500 years, she ceased to exist as a living poetic voice. Her 9 volumes were gone. Her name survived, but only as a ghost in the machine of classical scholarship, a fossil preserved in the amber of other men's writings. She became a poet's poet's poet, a name known only to the most erudite of scholars, who might encounter her mentioned in the works of authors like Plato, Aristotle, or Longinus. Grammarians would quote a single line of hers to illustrate a rare dialectical form or a peculiar metrical effect. She was reduced from the 10th Muse to a grammatical footnote. The person, the passion, the living, breathing woman behind the name was almost entirely lost. The lie of her suicide over Phaon, being a simple and dramatic story, survived more robustly than the complex truth of her art, ensuring that what little was remembered of her was a distortion. This was the nadir of her legacy, the point of maximum entropy, where her voice had faded to the faintest of whispers, audible only to a handful of antiquarians. Her enemies, it seemed, had won a total victory. The combination of active destruction and passive neglect had succeeded in erasing her from the cultural memory of the West. There was no last desperate attempt to hold on to power, because her power was already gone. She was a ruin, a magnificent temple, of which only a few scattered, inscribed stones remained, their original meaning almost entirely forgotten. It was a silence so profound and so prolonged that the idea that she could ever be resurrected as a vibrant artistic force would have seemed an impossible fantasy. The finale of Sappho's epic saga is not a scene of death, but one of resurrection, a dramatic return that is as improbable as it is cinematic. The stage for this final act is not a Greek island, but the desolate, sun-scorched landscape of Upper Egypt in the late 19th century. It is here, in the winter of 1896, that two young British archaeologists from Oxford University, Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt, began excavating the ancient rubbish mounds on the outskirts of the Greco-Roman town of Oxyrhynchus. They were not searching for poetry. They were hoping to find early Christian documents. But what they found was something far more vast and significant: the discarded paperwork of an entire civilization. For days, their workers unearthed mountains of papyrus fragments. Then, one day, a workman handed Grenfell a crumpled piece of papyrus. As he carefully flattened it, he saw the unmistakable lines of Greek lyric poetry, written in a beautiful ancient script. It was a text unknown to the modern world. Soon, more fragments appeared. When they returned to Oxford and began the painstaking work of deciphering and identifying their finds, the breathtaking truth became clear. They had found new, authentic, long-lost verses by Sappho. After nearly 1,000 years of near-total silence, her voice was speaking again, pulled literally from a garbage dump. This was her true finale, her last great act, unfolding millennia after her death. The circumstances were profoundly ironic. Her immortality was secured not by the careful curation of kings and librarians, but by the careless disposal of common people. The discovery at Oxyrhynchus, followed by other similar finds throughout the 20th century, was a turning point. It began the slow, laborious process of piecing her back together, of transforming her from a myth into a tangible, if still fragmentary, poet. Her last act was to return from the dead, a Lazarus of literature, brought back to life by the strange alchemy of sand, scholarship, and chance. The resurrection of Sappho's poetry from the sands of Egypt did not end the conflict surrounding her. It ignited a new and fiercer one. Her legacy has become a battleground for a host of conflicting interpretations, with each new era attempting to claim her as its own. For centuries, shaped by the Ovidian myth, she was seen primarily through a heterosexual lens, as the tragic, spurned lover of Phaon, a figure of romantic pathos. But with the recovery of more texts and a greater understanding of her world, this interpretation began to crumble. In the late 19th and 20th centuries, particularly with the rise of first-wave feminism and early gay rights movements, she was reclaimed as a pioneering lesbian icon. The very word, lesbian, derived from her home island of Lesbos, became inextricably linked to her name. She was hailed as a foremother, a symbol of love between women, a courageous voice from a distant past who affirmed same-sex desire. This interpretation, in turn, has been challenged by some classical scholars who argue for a more nuanced view, emphasizing the ritualistic and pedagogical context of the Theosos and cautioning against applying modern categories of sexual identity to the ancient world. For feminists, she is a powerful symbol of the female artistic voice, a rare example of a woman from Antiquity who competed with and was judged equal to the greatest male poets. For poets and literary critics, the primary focus is on her unparalleled technical skill, her revolutionary use of language, and her universal insights into the nature of human emotion, an interpretation that seeks to lift her above the politics of identity. This conflict of interpretations is not a sign of weakness, but of her incredible power. Like Shakespeare, she is a figure so profound and so resonant that she can contain multitudes. She is a mirror in which successive generations see their own struggles, their own passions, and their own ideals reflected, ensuring that the battle for her soul, and thus her relevance, will never truly end. And so, we arrive at the final, comprehensive solution to the central paradox. How did the whisper of a woman outlast the roar of empires? Why did her words survive? The answer is as simple as it is profound. Her poetry was encoded with a language more universal and more durable than any imperial decree or theological doctrine. It was the language of the human heart. Empires rise and fall on the foundations of politics, economics, and military power. Contingent, changeable forces. Their monuments are built of stone and bronze, materials that inevitably crack and corrode. Their ideologies are complex systems that eventually grow obsolete and are replaced. Sappho, by contrast, built her legacy out of the fundamental, unchanging elements of human experience. She wrote not of the Lydian invasion, but of the searing pain of jealousy. She wrote not of the constitution of Mytilene, but of the heartbreaking finality of a goodbye. She wrote not of the gods of Olympus as distant, cosmic powers, but of Aphrodite as the immediate, visceral force that makes the knees go weak. This raw, unfiltered emotional honesty is the key to her immortality. A person living in the 21st century may have nothing in common with the political realities of archaic Greece, but they know exactly what it feels like to see a former lover laughing with someone new. That precise feeling she describes as a fire running under the skin and a roaring in the ears. This is a code that needs no translation. The passions she described, longing, devotion, bitterness, joy, are the perennial constants of the human condition. Her words survived because they were not about her time. They were about all time. In focusing on the most intensely personal and private moments, she accidentally discovered the most universal and public truths, creating a body of work so fundamentally human that to destroy it, you would have to destroy humanity itself. The ultimate philosophical lesson of Sappho's saga is the profound and triumphant victory of the fragment over the whole. Our modern world is obsessed with completeness, with data, with massive archives, and unbroken narratives. We mourn the loss of the 99% of her work, seeing it as a catastrophic failure of preservation. But her story teaches us a different, more powerful lesson. It suggests that a single, perfect, surviving shard can contain more truth, beauty, and power than all the lost chronicles of forgotten kings. The verdict of history on Sappho is that true immortality is not found in grand imperial monuments or exhaustive, complete records. It is found in concentrated, perfect moments of expression. A single line, and I'm aware of it, can convey a universe of resignation and heartbreak. A single image, more golden than gold, can encapsulate a daughter's infinite worth. In her fragmentation, she becomes a symbol for the very nature of memory, which is itself a collection of powerful, disconnected moments rather than a continuous narrative. Her survival proves that the most resilient substance in the universe is not stone or steel, but a perfectly articulated human feeling. It demonstrates the almost supernatural power of art to transcend its own material destruction. The scrolls could be burned, the name could be slandered, the memory could be suppressed. But the essential truth contained in a handful of words, once spoken, could not be unspoken. It found a way to hibernate for 1,000 years in the darkness, waiting for a moment to be reborn. Her life is the ultimate testament to the idea that the grandest story is often told in the quietest whisper, and the most enduring legacy is the one that leaves just enough to the imagination to make us ache for more. The final frame is not a grand vista of ancient Greece, nor the fiery spectacle of a burning library. It is a quiet, intensely focused image. A single, tattered piece of papyrus, no bigger than a human hand, rests on a bed of dark velvet inside a climate-controlled glass case in a museum. Its edges are frayed, its color the pale brown of ancient dust. On its surface, illuminated by a single, soft light, are a few columns of faint, elegant Greek letters, the ink faded, but still legible. One does not need to read the language to understand what this object is. It is not a dead artifact. It is not a mere historical document. It is a living relic, a vessel containing a human heartbeat that has been beating for over 2,600 years. The air around it is silent, yet the object itself seems to hum with a captured energy, the ghost of a song once sung to the accompaniment of a lyre in a garden on Lesbos. This small, fragile shard is the delicious kebab, the concentrated essence of the entire epic saga. It is the physical proof that a voice can be stronger than stone, that an emotion can outlive a god, that a whisper can, against all odds and all enemies, finally and irrevocably, outlast the roar. This fragment is Sappho's ultimate victory, a testament to a love so powerful it conquered the greatest enemy of all, time itself.